What would you risk to feed a stranger when you barely have enough to survive yourself? In the winter of 1868, one widow's simple act of mercy sparked a chain of events that would bring hundreds of warriors to her doorstep and force her to stand between two worlds, ready to destroy each other. Watch till the end to see how compassion became the most dangerous weapon on the frontier. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible stories tomorrow. Also, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's continue with the story. Winter had turned the Arizona Territory into a land of bones and dust. Outside Fort Defiance, where the scrub stretched empty for miles, Abigail Crane stood at her cabin window, watching the fence line. 34 years old, and every one of them written in the lines around her eyes. Martin had been dead 3 years now, fever taking him before he ever saw their farm produce a decent crop. She lived alone on 4 acres that fought her every season, with one cow that gave milk only when it felt charitable, and chickens that seemed to lay eggs out of spite rather than regularity. She was measuring out cornmeal for her own breakfast when she saw them. 8 figures at the fence, thin as shadows, watching her cabin. Her hand froze on the measuring cup. Navajo. Had to be. Their clothes hung loose on frames that looked like they'd been whittled down to nothing but will and bone. Even from 50 yards, she could see how they swayed on their feet. Fort Defiance had been buzzing for weeks about escaped Navajo from Bosque Redondo, that god-forsaken reservation 300 miles east, where the Army had marched them 4 years back. The Long Walk, people called it. Thousands forced from their homeland at gunpoint. Word was, some were making their way back, half dead and desperate. The nearest settler, Jeremiah Potts, had told her just last week that any Navajo showing up should be reported to the fort immediately. He'd leaned close when he said it, his breath sour with whiskey. "They're dangerous when they're starving," he'd warned. "They'll cut your throat for a loaf of bread." But these men weren't approaching. They just stood there, hands empty, staring, waiting. Abigail looked down at her cornmeal, at the dried venison hanging from her rafter, at the bucket of well water by her door. She thought about Martin, about the fever that had taken him while she watched helpless, about hunger, about the kind of desperation that makes a man stand at a stranger's fence, hoping for mercy. She made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She gathered the cornbread she'd baked the day before, filled a pot with venison, and carried it outside. The morning air bit cold. The 8 warriors watched her approach, their eyes hollow, but alert. The one in front had a scar running from his temple to his jaw, old and white against his dark skin. He looked at the food in her arms, then at her face, searching for the trick, the trap. Abigail set the pot and bread on the ground between them. She stepped back. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the scarred warrior placed his hand over his heart and nodded once. They came forward slowly, like men who'd forgotten what kindness looked like and didn't quite trust it. They ate quickly, tearing the cornbread with shaking hands, drinking straight from the pot. Not one of them spoke. When they finished, the scarred warrior pressed his palm to his heart again, held her gaze for 3 seconds, then turned. The 8 of them walked back toward the hills, moving like ghosts through the scrub. Abigail stood there until they disappeared. She picked up her empty pot and walked back to her cabin, not knowing she'd just lit a fuse that would bring the entire territory down on her head by sunset. Abigail spent the afternoon mending fence posts, her hands working automatically, while her mind replayed the morning, The scarred warrior's eyes, the way they'd eaten like men who'd forgotten food existed. She drove another nail into the split wood and looked up. Smoke rose from the hills. 3 columns, straight and deliberate, spaced evenly across the horizon. Her hammer slowed. Those weren't cooking fires. They were signals. She watched the smoke climb into the winter sky, and something cold settled in her chest. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather. By late afternoon, dust appeared where the smoke had been. A lot of dust. She stood, shading her eyes against the low sun. Figures emerged from the scrub. Not 8 this time. Dozens. She counted 40 before she lost track, her breath coming faster. More kept coming. Mounted warriors on horses that looked as starved as their riders. People on foot, moving in groups. They were converging on her property from 3 different directions. Organized. Purposeful. Her nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. She had no gun. Martin had owned a rifle once, but she'd traded it for seed corn 2 winters back. All she had was a skinning knife in her kitchen. The warriors weren't charging. They moved in formation, steady and deliberate. The scarred warrior from the morning rode at the front on a paint horse with visible ribs. Behind him came more warriors, then women, then children, then elders being supported by younger men. This wasn't an attack, but Abigail had no idea what it was. They stopped at her fence line, 50 yards from her cabin. The scarred warrior dismounted and walked forward alone. Abigail's legs wanted to run, but she forced herself to stand still. He stopped 10 feet away and spoke in Navajo, words tumbling out fast. She shook her head. He tried again, mixing Navajo with broken English, his hands gesturing. Through the fractured language and movement of his hands, pieces emerged. You showed mercy. White settlers don't show mercy. This creates bond. Debt. He pointed at the ground beneath their feet, then swept his arm toward the mountains. This land sits on path home, path to Deneta, our homeland. He wasn't asking permission. He was telling her they would camp here, that they would protect this ground, because she'd protected them. Abigail looked past him at the crowd gathering behind. 200 people at least, maybe more. Gaunt faces wrapped in tattered blankets. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes. Old women who looked like they'd walked through fire. Old men who stared at nothing. She thought about her 4 acres, her 1 cow, her half-empty root cellar. The cornbread she had left wouldn't feed 20 people, let alone 200. The scarred warrior watched her, waiting. Behind him, the crowd waited. The sun dropped lower, painting everything red. Abigail looked at these people who'd walked 300 miles from hell, who'd been starved and broken and were somehow still standing. She thought about the 8 warriors this morning, about the hand pressed to the heart. She nodded. Just once. The scarred warrior turned and raised his hand. Behind him, people began moving, setting down bundles, gathering stones for fires. Children sat heavily in the dirt, like their legs had finally given out. Within minutes, camps were spreading across her property, filling every open space with the business of survival. Abigail stood in front of her cabin, watching her world transform into something she couldn't name and didn't understand. But somewhere in the chaos, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in 3 years, her land held life beyond her own. Word traveled fast on the frontier. By nightfall, someone had ridden to Fort Defiance with news that hundreds of Navajo had gathered at the Crane farm. By dawn, Captain Eldridge Thorne was saddling his horse. Abigail woke to the sound of horses, lots of them. She stepped outside to see blue uniforms cresting the ridge, at least 30 soldiers in formation. The Navajo camps stirred immediately. Warriors stood, positioning themselves between the soldiers and the women and children. The scarred warrior moved to the front, his hand resting on a knife at his belt. Captain Thorne rode forward, his jaw set like granite. He was a tall man with gray streaking his temples and eyes that had seen too many things to trust anything. He'd been part of the Long Walk 4 years back, had marched Navajo families at gunpoint through winter cold. Abigail knew his type. Men who followed orders and slept fine afterward. He stopped his horse 20 feet from where Abigail stood. "What's happening here, Mrs. Crane?" His voice carried across the morning silence. His hand rested on his sidearm. "They're refugees," Abigail said. "They're starving. I invited them to stay." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "You invited 200 hostile Navajo to camp on your property? Ma'am, have you lost your mind? They're not hostile. They're dying." Thorne looked past her at the camps, at the warriors watching him. "These are escaped prisoners from Bosque Redondo. They're in violation of federal containment policy. They need to be returned immediately." "Returned to what?" Abigail stepped forward. "To that death camp you people built? I've heard what happens at Bosque Redondo, Captain. Starvation rations, disease, children dying in the dirt. You want to send them back to that?" Thorne's face hardened. "What I want doesn't matter. I follow orders. These Navajo are government property." The scarred warrior moved beside Abigail. He didn't speak, but his presence said everything. Thorne's hand tightened on his pistol. Behind him, soldiers raised their rifles. Behind Abigail, warriors drew knives and raised what weapons they had. The air went electric with violence waiting to happen. Then an old Navajo woman stepped forward. "Azongon Tuogi," though Abigail didn't know her name yet. She began singing, her voice cracked but steady, a protection song. Other voices joined hers, rising in harmony that had survived centuries. Thorne's horse shifted nervously. "Shoot them," one of his lieutenants said quietly. Abigail walked forward until she stood between the soldiers and the singing Navajo. Her heart hammered, but her voice came out steady. "If you fire, Captain, you fire through me first." The standoff stretched. 7 minutes that felt like hours. Soldiers with fingers on triggers, warriors ready to die. An old woman singing, and Abigail Crane standing in the middle, a widow with nothing left to lose and everything suddenly worth protecting. Thorne's jaw worked. Finally, he yanked his reins hard. "Fall back," he ordered. His voice was tight with fury, but he looked at Abigail one last time. "This isn't over, Mrs. Crane. Not by a damn sight." The soldiers turned and rode away. Abigail's knees nearly gave out. The scarred warrior caught her elbow, steadying her. The old woman stopped singing and placed a weathered hand on Abigail's cheek, speaking words she couldn't understand, but felt in her bones. The camps erupted in relieved chaos, but Abigail stood there, shaking, knowing Thorne meant every word. He'd be back, and next time, he wouldn't ask permission. Abigail's food stores disappeared within a day. The cornbread, the dried venison, the last of her flour. All gone. She stood in her empty root cellar that evening, staring at bare shelves, wondering if she'd just killed herself through kindness. But the next morning, 3 warriors appeared at her door with jackrabbits, already skinned and cleaned. By afternoon, women arrived with baskets of piñon nuts and wild onions they'd gathered from the scrub. An elder showed her how to make paper bread over hot stones, the dough thin and crispy, stretching their meager supplies further than Abigail thought possible. They weren't just taking. They were sharing everything they had, which wasn't much, but it was offered freely. The scarred warrior came to her fire on the third night. He sat across from her, the flames casting shadows on his damaged face. He pointed to himself. Hashkeyu Naba, he said slowly. Abigail repeated it, mangling the pronunciation. He smiled slightly and tried again, patient. After 5 attempts, she got close enough that he nodded approval. He pointed at her, questioning. Abigail, she said. Abigail Crane. He tried it, the syllables awkward in his mouth. Ab-e-gail. She nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Then Hashke pointed at the mountains, at the camps around them, and spoke in halting English mixed with Navajo. Wife, 2 sons, all dead. Bosque Redondo. His voice broke on the words. He held up his fingers. 300 miles. Walking. Home. Abigail felt something crack open in her chest. My husband, she said quietly. Martin. Fever. 3 years. She touched the wedding ring still on her finger. No children. Hashke looked at her with understanding that needed no translation. 2 people hollowed out by loss, sitting at the same fire. He said something in Navajo, soft and sad. Then he taught her new words. Ahehi, thank you. Ya'ate, hello. Shikis, my friend. She repeated them, her tongue clumsy around the sounds. He corrected her gently, and when she finally got ahehi right, he pressed his hand to his heart the way he had that first morning. Over the next days, Abigail learned more. She learned that Astzongontuugi, the old woman who'd sung the protection song, had lost her husband and daughter on the long walk. That the children playing near her fence had watched their siblings die at Bosque Redondo. That every person in these camps carried scars deeper than skin. She told Hashke about Missouri, about coming west because there was nothing left for her back east, about working land that didn't want to be worked, about nights so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat and wished it would stop. One evening, while teaching her to grind piñon nuts properly, Astzongontuogi took Abigail's hand and spoke to Hashke. He translated haltingly. She says you have good heart. Says the land knew. Sent us to you. Sent you to us. Abigail looked around at the camps, at people who'd survived hell and were teaching her how to make bread, sharing meat they'd hunted, treating her like family. She'd been alone for 3 years, and in 3 days, these strangers had given her something she'd forgotten existed. Purpose. Connection. A reason to wake up that wasn't just stubborn survival. That night, lying in her cabin, she realized she wasn't protecting them anymore. They were protecting each other. But outside, in the darkness beyond the firelight, threats were gathering that kindness alone couldn't stop. 1 week in, and starvation was winning. The piñon nuts were gone. The game was getting scarce, the warriors having to range further each day for smaller catches. Children cried at night with empty bellies. Fort Defiance sent no supplies. The army had made their position clear. Let them starve or leave. A young warrior named Naelnish started talking about the supply wagons that ran between the fort and the territorial capital. 22 years old, with anger burning hotter than good sense. He gathered 6 others around a fire one night, speaking low and fast. Hashkeyu Naba heard about it and shut it down hard. No raids, he said in Navajo that needed no translation. Raiding would bring soldiers down on all of them, would get people killed. They'd survived 300 miles. They could survive this. But that night, while Hashke slept, Naalnish and his 6 rode out. They hit the supply wagon 15 miles from the fort just after dawn. The 2 guards fought back harder than expected. Shots fired. One guard went down with an arrow in his shoulder. The other took a knife wound across his ribs before he fled on horseback. Naalnish and his warriors took the wagon, flour and salted pork and dried beans, and drove it hard back toward camp. Abigail was drawing water from her well when she heard the wagon coming fast. She looked up to see Naalnish driving, the others riding alongside, and blood on 3 of them. Her stomach dropped. Hashke emerged from his shelter, and his face went dark as a storm. He strode to the wagon and grabbed Naalnish by his shirt, yanking him down. They argued in rapid Navajo. Hashke's voice controlled fury. Naalnish shouting back that people were starving, that the army owed them this and more, that hiding and begging wasn't the warrior way. Hashke struck him. Once, hard enough to split Naalnish's lip. The camp went silent. "You killed us all," Hashke said in English, for Abigail's benefit. "You killed us all." 2 of the warriors were bleeding badly. Abigail ran to them, helped them into her cabin. One had a bullet graze across his shoulder. The other had been slashed across his forearm, deep enough to see bone. She tore her spare dress into bandages, pressed cloth against wounds, her hands shaking. Outside, arguments erupted. Warriors split between those who supported the raid and those who saw it as suicide. Women pulled children closer. Elders sat in grim silence, knowing what came next. Hashke appeared in Abigail's doorway while she wrapped the 2nd warrior's arm. His face was carved from stone. "They will come at dawn," he said, "with more soldiers. They will not talk this time." Abigail tied off the bandage. "How many?" "Enough." He looked at the wounded men, then at her. "You should leave tonight. Go to your neighbor. Tell them you were held against will. They might believe you. And you? We run or we die." He said it simply, like stating weather. But we knew this when we left Bosque Redondo. Death chasing, or death waiting. Same death. Abigail stood, her dress stained with blood that wasn't hers. "I'm not leaving." Hashke met her eyes. "You are foolish, woman." "Maybe, but I'm not running either." Outside, the camp prepared for war or flight, and the night felt like a held breath before a scream. Captain Thorne arrived with 40 soldiers at first light. No talking this time. He rode straight to Abigail's cabin with a piece of paper in his hand, his face carved from ice. "Mrs. Crane," he called out, "I have a warrant for the arrest of the men who attacked a federal supply wagon yesterday. 1 guard is dead. You will turn over the responsible parties immediately, or face charges for harboring fugitives." Abigail stepped outside. Behind her, Hashke emerged from the cabin where he'd been checking on the wounded. Thorne's hand moved to his pistol. "How many men you want?" Hashke asked in broken English. "Take me. Leave others." "No," Abigail said sharply. She turned to Thorne. "That raid happened because your army broke every treaty promise ever made, because you starved these people at Bosque Redondo, because children are dying, and you won't send 1 sack of flour." Thorne's jaw tightened. "I don't make policy, ma'am. I enforce it. You have 1 hour to decide. Turn over the raiders, or everyone here will be removed by force, and you'll be arrested for aiding enemies of the United States. This land belonged to the Navajo before it belonged to anyone." Abigail shot back. Her voice was shaking, but her feet stayed planted. "Before your government decided it could draw lines on maps and call it law." 1 hour, Thorne repeated. He wheeled his horse around. Hashke watched the soldiers take positions along the ridge. "They will not wait full hour," he said quietly. "They want blood." Abigail turned to find Azdzomom Twaugi approaching. The old woman carried something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it to reveal a bracelet woven from wool and silver, intricate patterns that spoke of family and belonging. She placed it on Abigail's wrist and spoke in Navajo. "She calls you daughter," Hashke translated. His voice was thick. "Says you are one of us now." Abigail looked down at the bracelet, at this symbol of acceptance from people who owed her nothing. Then she looked up at the camps, at families huddled together, at children who'd already seen too much death. The Navajo began to move, not to pack, not to flee. They formed a circle around Abigail's cabin, warriors in front, women and elders behind, children in the center. A human wall between the soldiers and their target. They stood silent, defiant, ready to die together rather than be torn apart again. Thorne saw it happening and stood in his stirrups. "What the hell are they doing?" "Protecting their own," Abigail said, loud enough to carry. "And I'm their own now." 30 minutes passed. The soldiers formed a line. The Navajo didn't move. Abigail stood at the center of the circle, her heart hammering, knowing that in minutes this would end in blood. She'd fed 8 starving men, and it had led here, to this moment where mercy would be answered with bullets. Thorne raised his hand to signal the advance. Rifles came up. The Navajo braced themselves. Azdzomom Twaugi began singing again, that protection song, and others joined until the morning air filled with voices that refused to be silenced. Then a single rider appeared on the eastern ridge, civilian clothes, riding fast. He raised a white handkerchief tied to a stick and rode straight between the two groups like a man who'd lost his mind or never had any fear to begin with. The rider was a thin man in his 50s, wearing spectacles and a suit that had seen better days. He dismounted between the armed soldiers and the circled Navajo like he was stepping off a train at a station. Thorne looked at him like he'd sprouted wings. "Judge Horace Cuttingham," the man announced. "Territorial Circuit. I'm here to investigate reports of an Indian uprising." "There's no investigation needed," Thorne said, his voice tight. "These are escaped prisoners who attacked federal property. I have authority to remove them." Cuttingham pulled out a notebook and pencil. "You have authority over reservation land, Captain. This is private property." He looked at Abigail. "Are these people here with your permission, ma'am?" "Yes," Abigail said. "And have they threatened you in any way?" "No. They've shared their food with me, protected me." Cuttingham wrote this down while Thorne's face went red. "Your Honor, with respect, this woman is clearly under duress. Captain, I've been a judge for 23 years. I know duress when I see it." Cuttingham walked through the circle of Navajo, examining faces, stopping to look at the children. He crouched beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, her ribs visible through her dress. When did this child last have a full meal? No one answered. Cuttingham stood and turned to Thorne. "I was at Bosque Redondo last year, Captain. I documented what I saw for the territorial governor. Starvation rations, contaminated water, hundreds dead from disease. The eastern newspapers are already calling it a death camp." "Those people violated containment," Thorne insisted. "Those people walked 300 miles to avoid dying in a hole you put them in." Cuttingham's voice cut like a blade. "And now you want to drag them back at gunpoint because someone stole food to keep children from starving." "A guard was killed," Thorne shot back. Cuttingham looked at him over his spectacles. "Were you going to mention that the guard survived? He's at the fort right now with a shoulder wound." "No one died, Captain. You came here with 40 armed men to arrest starving refugees over stolen flour. The law is the law, Thorne said, but his voice had lost its edge. Then let's discuss the law. Cuttingham pulled out another paper. The Army has no legal authority to remove peaceful Indians from private property if the landowner consents to their presence. Arresting Mrs. Crane would create a political disaster, given the current scrutiny of Indian policy. So here's what's going to happen. He looked at both parties. I'm ordering emergency food supplies delivered here within 2 days. The Navajo can stay for 2 weeks to recover their strength before moving on. No arrests, no forced removal. This is outrageous, Thorne started. This is territorial law, Captain, and I outrank you in every way that matters right now. Thorne sat rigid in his saddle, fury radiating off him. Finally, he jerked his reins. Fall back, to his men. But his eyes promised Abigail this wasn't forgiveness. The soldiers withdrew. The Navajo circle broke apart slowly, people collapsing with relief. Cuttingham approached Abigail as she stood shaking. You bought them time, Mrs. Crane. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I can stall the bureaucracy. But understand this. He lowered his voice. The territory wants them gone. Your protection won't last. Use this time wisely. What happens after? Abigail asked. That depends on how far they can get and how much trouble they avoid. He tipped his hat. You're a brave woman. Probably too brave for your own good. He rode away, leaving Abigail standing with a temporary reprieve that felt more like a countdown to disaster. The promised food arrived in 2 days. Flour, dried beef, beans. Not generous portions, but enough to stop the immediate dying. For 2 weeks, Abigail's farm became something she'd never imagined. A place of healing. She taught Navajo children to write their names in English, scratching letters in the dirt with sticks. A girl named Deeb learned to write D-I-B-E and squealed with delight, showing everyone. Warriors repaired Abigail's cabin roof, replacing rotted boards she'd ignored for years. They dug her well deeper, hitting a better water source that ran clearer and colder. Asdonontuogi spent 3 days weaving a blanket for Abigail, incorporating patterns that meant family, protection, belonging. She presented it one evening with ceremony, speaking words that Hashke translated. This pattern is my family's. 4 generations. Now it is yours too. You carry us with you always. Abigail wrapped herself in it that night and cried for the first time since Martin died. Not from sadness, but from feeling something break loose inside her, some frozen part finally thawing. On the 12th day, Hashke found her watching the sunset from her porch. He sat beside her in the silence they'd become comfortable with. Then he spoke, careful with his English words. We leave in 3 days. Go north to Chuska Mountains, to Dineta, our home. Abigail nodded, feeling the loss already settling in. Come with us, Hashke said. She turned to him, certain she'd misheard. What? Come with us. You have no family here, no husband, no children. You work land that fights you. His eyes were serious. You would be welcome. You are already family. Abigail's breath caught. I'm not Navajo. Family is not always blood. You stood between us and bullets. Twice. You fed us when we were dying. You are more family than blood relatives who abandoned us at Bosque Redondo. She looked out at the camps, at people who'd become part of her daily life. The children who ran to show her things they'd found. The women who taught her their language. The warriors who nodded, respect when she passed. She thought about this cabin, about Martin's grave under the cottonwood, about 3 years of loneliness. I need time to think, she said quietly. That night she couldn't sleep. She walked her property in the moonlight, touching the fence Martin built, running her hands over wood he'd shaped. She stood at his grave and spoke to him for the first time in a year. I don't know what to do, she whispered. You're here, but you're not here, and they're leaving and I don't want to be alone again. At dawn, she found Hashke preparing his horse. I'll come, she said. Not forever. I'll see you home safely, then come back. But I'll come. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. That is enough. Azongontwogi appeared beside them, smiling like she'd known all along. She took Abigail's hand and said something in Navajo. She says some people are meant to walk between two worlds, Hashke translated. Says you are bridge, not because you choose, but because you are. 3 days later, they broke camp. 200 Navajo and 1 white widow heading north toward mountains that promised home. Abigail looked back once at her cabin, small and lonely against the scrub. Then she turned forward and kept walking. The journey took 3 weeks. They moved slowly because of the children and elders, following paths that avoided military patrols and settler routes. Abigail learned what real walking meant. Her feet blistered, then hardened. Her legs ached every night and felt strong by morning. She carried children when they tired, shared water when it was scarce, and learned to read the land the way Hashke and the others did. They passed through canyons where red rock rose like cathedral walls, crossed streams that ran clear and cold, slept under stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. Abigail had never seen country like this, harsh and beautiful in equal measure. One evening, Hashke pointed to mountains rising in the distance. Chuska Mountains, he said. Dineta. Home. His voice broke on the last word. The next day they crossed into land the army had never fully controlled. Navajo territory that had resisted every attempt at total conquest. People began to move faster, pulling strength from somewhere deep. Children who'd been dragging their feet suddenly ran ahead. They crested a ridge, and below them spread a valley with hogans scattered across it, traditional dwellings that looked like they'd grown from the earth itself. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People emerged from the structures, shading their eyes, then began shouting and running toward them. The reunion was chaos and joy mixed with tears. Families finding each other after 4 years of forced separation. Mothers embracing sons they'd thought dead. Old men falling to their knees and pressing their faces to the ground, touching home. Abigail stood to the side, watching, feeling like an intruder in this moment of belonging. But Hashke found her and pulled her forward. An elderly woman approached, her face carved with wrinkles and wisdom. She looked at Hashke, then at Abigail, and spoke rapidly in Navajo. Hashke responded, gesturing to Abigail as he spoke. The old woman stepped close and embraced Abigail like she'd known her forever. "This is my mother," Hashke said quietly. "I told her you fed me when I was dying, that you stood between us and soldiers, that you have heart of warrior." His mother pulled back and spoke again, her eyes bright with tears. "She calls you the woman who fed her son when the world offered only cruelty," Hashke translated. "She says you are blessed." That evening, the community gathered. Over 200 people who'd made the journey, plus those who'd been hiding here all along. They built a massive fire. Azonotwogi stood and spoke, her voice carrying across the crowd. Others added their voices, telling the story of what happened at Abigail's farm. Then the elders conferred. They approached Abigail, and one of them, a man older than Drought, placed his hand on her head and spoke words that felt like prayer. Hashke stood beside her. "They give you Navajo name, he said. As zomon bideo, woman who feeds. It is great honor. You are recognized as friend of the people. You will always have place among us. Abigail felt the weight of it, this naming, this acceptance. She looked around at faces lit by firelight, at people who'd walked through hell and survived. I have to go back, she said to Hashke, to my farm, to Martin's grave. I know, he said, but you take us with you, and we are here when you need us, always. She stayed 3 more days, learning names, hearing stories, being woven into a community that would never forget what she'd done. Then she prepared for the journey back, alone this time, but not lonely. The journey back took Abigail 2 weeks alone. Hashke had offered warriors to escort her, but she'd refused. She needed this time to think, to understand what had happened to her life in the span of a month. She'd fed 8 starving men and somehow found a family that stretched across 2 worlds. When her cabin finally came into view, she stopped on the ridge above it. Her chest tightened, expecting to see it burned or ransacked. The army had plenty of time, so had angry settlers who'd heard what she'd done. But from this distance, everything looked intact. She walked down slowly, watching for signs of destruction. The fence was still standing. Her cow grazed peacefully. The chickens scattered as she approached. She reached her door and pushed it open, half expecting to find the inside gutted. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. More than that. A stack of firewood sat beside her door, cut and split, enough for a month. She walked around back to her shed and found fresh game hanging, properly dressed and smoked. Rabbit, quail, and a haunch of deer. Hoofprints covered the ground around her property. Dozens of them, coming and going. The Navajo had been watching over her land while she was gone, protecting it, providing for her return. Abigail sat on her porch steps and looked out at the empty camps where 200 people had lived for 2 weeks. The fire circles were still visible in the dirt. She could almost hear the children laughing, the women singing, As zoon twogi, weaving by firelight. She touched the bracelet still on her wrist, then pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the one with family patterns woven through it. She wasn't alone anymore. Hadn't been since that first morning when 8 starving men stood at her fence and she'd chosen mercy over fear. That evening, she walked to Martin's grave under the cottonwood. I met some people, she said to the headstone. They needed help, and I helped them, and they helped me back. I think you would have liked them. I think you would have fed them too. She stood there as the sun set, painting the scrub in shades of gold and red. Smoke rose from the Chuska Mountains in the distance, 3 columns spaced evenly. A signal. They were watching. They were there. Abigail Crane walked back to her cabin as darkness fell. She lit her fire, cooked her meal, and ate alone, but not lonely. Because somewhere in those mountains, a people who'd survived everything carried her name in their stories. Woman who feeds. The white widow who stood between them and bullets. Who chose courage when the world offered only cruelty. She'd fed 8 warriors and gained a family that would last beyond her lifetime. Some debts, she'd learned, aren't about repayment. They're about recognition. About seeing another person's humanity and acting on it, even when everything says you shouldn't. Outside, the fire circles remained in her dirt like scars that had healed into something beautiful. And in the mountains, the smoke signals promised what she already knew. She would never truly be alone again. If this story moved you, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because tomorrow we have another incredible true story that will remind you why courage and compassion matter more than we think. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.